Hello everyone, welcome to your library at home. My name is Sam Hagan and I'm part of the State Library's public programming team. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that we meet on country. I live and work on Gadigal land and I'd like to take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders, past, present and especially emerging. I also extend my respect to any Aboriginal Australians who may be joining us today. Welcome everyone to the latest in our series of online curator talks. Today we're going to hear from Margot Riley. Margot, as well as being my colleague, is a library curator and cultural historian with special interests in art, popular culture, photography and dress. She has since written, she's written and lectured extensively about the library's collection, and she's also curated numerous exhibitions and displays. In fact, the first exhibition that I ever worked on joining the library was one of Margot's. It's called On Sale. It's brilliant. Today, Margot, we're talking about something a bit different. She's going to be starting off about a tiny oil sketch of Jean Sandro Russell, which was painted by his father, and talk a little bit about the surprising place that it holds in Australian art history. As always, there'll be time for some questions at the end, so do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you've got a question you'd like to ask Margot, and I'll come back on at the end to have a chat with her with your questions. So until then, I'm going to say, Margot, are you with me?
Yes, I am here.
I'll hand over to you.
The miracle of modern technology. This is my first time, so please forgive any nervousness. I would also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which the library is built, and also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to Aboriginal Australians listening to this presentation today. I would also like to acknowledge work of my colleagues here at the State Library, Helen Casey and Kate Hughes, and other scholars working in the field, including Paula Dredge, Wayne Tunnicliffe from the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and Anne Galbally and Robin Sloggett from the University of Melbourne, on whose research much of what I'm going to talk about today is based. I also would recommend that you perhaps go to the State Library magazine. A lot of the detail, the technical detail about what I'm going to suggest today is reported in an article that was prepared for the winter issue in 2019. So let's get going. Oh, hang on, I have to share my screen. What did I do? I wrecked it already. Okay. What do I need to do? Sorry, we're just technical hitch. We'll just wait a minute. Okay. Right, so the title of today's talk is In Love and Friendship, the Art of John Peter Russell. Now, most people, if they know of the work of Russell, are familiar perhaps with his seascapes, these really turbulent seascapes, which have sort of captured the imagination of Australian art lovers in the last few decades. But really, it wasn't until the 1960s that his work began to be acknowledged and even collected in Australia or even around the world. And most people are unaware that there is a small arresting canvas that's held in the collection of the State Library of New South Wales. And I think that's actually one of the joys of working here at the library. Our collections are so vast and cover so many areas, and there's always surprising things to find. And so in preparing the paintings in the collection display, which was part of the library's refreshing of their gallery spaces, some colleagues and I, some curatorial colleagues and conservators, had a program of investigation where we went through the library's paintings on canvas collections, and which meant, pulling out, as you can see the image on the left, this is the framed pictures store, and we slowly but surely worked our way through this collection. The library has over 3,000 oil paintings in its, and framed works, in its collections. And amongst them, as you can see, is this small canvas of a young boy, which is sort of sitting here in the middle of the rack. And when we checked the record and I saw that it was painted by John Peter Russell, I thought that was an extraordinary thing that it was in the library's collection. There was around about this time an exhibition at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, which looked quite deeply at Russell's work. And it really seemed interesting to me that perhaps the art gallery hadn't known of this work, and just what was it all about. So that began me on a journey to sort of look into this painting. It also has a strange sort of look about it, and we sort of wondered if this was perhaps a lesser work or something where something had gone wrong. So we had to do, we decided we'd do a bit of a scientific investigation and also a research, perhaps the backstory of how this little canvas had been created. But first I'll just start with a bit of an overview about John Peter Russell, for those who perhaps are not so familiar with him and his work. So John Peter Russell was born in Sydney. He came from a very wealthy family with an engineering works, and it was his family had intended that that is where he would be. That would be his life. He was sent off to England to have an apprenticeship at the Roby factory in Lincoln. And he really, even though he had this passion for art his entire life, his mother was very supportive, but his father was intent on him becoming an engineer. And somewhat fortunately, perhaps, his father passed away. I suppose that doesn't sound very nice, but it actually meant that John he inherited a vast fortune, and he was able to pursue his artistic passions. So after a short visit back in Sydney in 1879, he immediately set off for London to attend the Slade School. And it was at the Slade School that he learned the technique of portrait painting, which really informs the works that we have in the library's collection. He also met a lot of other artists and had a very strong friendship with artists, including the Australian artist Tom Roberts, who was living in London at the time. He did come back to Australia. He was very intent on remaining an Australian, even though he enjoyed living and working in Europe. He came back as you can see from this slide, in about 1881, and he immediately began participating in the community, the artistic community in Sydney. And one of the key places for people to see artworks was at the Society of Artists exhibitions. And in 1882, they were scheduled to be displayed in the Garden Palace. So you can see on the left this wonderful view of the exhibition building that was built for the first international exhibition in Australia in 1879. The paintings were all ready to go. They were all sitting there in the exhibition, and literally overnight the Garden Palace burnt down in September 72. So the artists of Sydney were faced with the challenge of recreating or replacing those artworks very rapidly. And this was a challenge that Russell rose to. He was when the exhibition finally opened at the Sydney Town Hall in March 83, he was the largest exhibitor. And you can see in this engraving from the Sydney Illustrated News, there's a painting up on the top over the doorway, and it is actually Russell's Ariadne here. And it was purchased by the president of the New South Wales Art Society. And I mention that because Coombs was an engineer, and I think a lot of Russell's connections in Sydney were friendship-based. And we see that very much through the artwork that he created during this time that he was in Australia. So one of the paintings that was on display in the third artists exhibition is this wonderful view of George Street by Alfred Tischbauer, which is part of the Dixon Gallery collection. And it's extraordinary documentation of the hustle and bustle of a Sydney street. And there's a cluster of figures in the left of the centre that's in the circle there. And if you look over to the left, the gentleman in the grey suit is thought to be John Russell, and the man in the top hat is thought to be Coombs. So to have these two men captured together in this painting by another artistic colleague really cements that idea of how close and the friendships and mentorship would have been between the two men. So here's another, this is the painting on the right that was painted by Russell of his friend Edward Coombs. He was, again, an artist himself as the president of the Art Society. And you can, even though he was an engineer, it was his hobby. And you can see here he is at the easel with his palette, and another image showing the en plein air, because that was the tradition that people were following at the time, painting outdoors, and Russell was very much a part of that school as well. Here are a couple of other, as I say, there were 17 artworks that he submitted to the exhibition, and the one on the left is of Thomas Richards. Now, he was the New South Wales government printer. So this portrait actually is held also by the library. Another surprising holding we have perhaps of the work of Russell. The Coombs's painting is held in a private collection, and the one on the end, within the list of portraits that is mentioned that Russell contributed to the exhibition, is one of a gentleman called Edward Perrier, Professor Perrier. And it's felt that this painting here, Portrait of a Man, might well be Perrier. And I mention this because at this time, Russell was intent on going back to France and to work and live in France. And Perrier was the expert at teaching French. So you can imagine that if you are wanting to perfect French so that you're able to live and work in Paris, you would go to the man who would be able to give you the best instruction. And this is a great article out of the newspaper, which is telling about this revolutionary technique that Perrier has, and how people become like native speakers, within a very short amount of time. So there is a connection between Perrier and Russell, and I don't have the exact proof, but I'm pretty sure it's would have emerged around this time, especially if he is painting a portrait of Perrier. So Russell does go back to London. He continues his painting studies, and eventually he goes to Paris, where he works in the school of Fernand Camon, and this is where, of course, he meets Vincent van Gogh. And this is an incredibly important friendship for them. The portrait of Van Gogh is considered to be Russell's pièce de résistance, and also the best portrait known of Vincent. The two men really shared a love of their technique. They shared a lot of ideas, especially around the idea of palette and paint, and the revolution that was sort of happening in the era of the impressionists, about the range of colours that would be used and the way they would be applied to canvas. Also in Paris at this time, Russell meets his partner and future wife, Marianne Antoinetta Mattiocco, who was an artist model. And this is a portrait, a photographic portrait that Russell has overdrawn and also overwritten. And this was a technique that he was to continue to use throughout his life. It's also around about this time that for the first time Russell and Marianne go to Belle-Île, which is an island off the coast of Brittany in the north of France. And it's while they're there in 1886 that Russell has an encounter with Claude Monet. So this is an extraordinary meeting, and there's a wonderful quote from Monet that you can see on the screen, talking about the impact of going to Belle-Île and the influence it's having on his artwork. And that watching Monet paint so rapidly, several canvases out at one time, and the palette that Monet used was very influential for Russell to sort of overthrow some of the older ideas that he had about art that he had perhaps picked up at the Slade School, and he much more became influenced by the French style of painting. It was also around about this time that Rodin and Russell formed a very strong friendship. Rodin was absolutely smitten with the beauty of Madame Russell, and these extraordinary busts were commissioned. The silver bust is in the Louvre, and it was actually on display in Sydney during that exhibition that was at the Art Gallery, if people did go to that. And this is Rodin's assessment of Russell. Your works will live, I am certain, one day you will be placed on the same level with our friends Monet, Renoir and Van Gogh, which is quite an extraordinary statement for such an icon of sculpture and art, to be acknowledging the abilities of Russell at a time when he really wasn't well known. Being a very wealthy man, he didn't have that same impetus to exhibit or sell his works the way other artists did, which actually gave him an extraordinary opportunity to experiment. He didn't have to worry about whether other people liked the subject matter or the results. He was able to indulge his own fascination and interest. And this is, I think, where we get a bit of a departure from his colleagues in Australia, like Tom Roberts. So at this time, as I've mentioned, Russell was very keen on documenting his friends. We saw the Sydney portraits, but with the moving into the later part of the 80s and the change in his palette, it's really interesting to compare these two portraits, the one of Vincent van Gogh and one that was painted of Dr. Will Maloney. He was an Australian doctor who was in London and travelled with Russell and also with Tom Roberts, and Russell painted this portrait of Maloney to really document his thinking about art at this time. And Maloney took it back with him when he returned to Australia, and the intent was that it would be shown to Roberts, and in letters that Russell wrote to Roberts, which also extraordinarily are held in the library's collection, you get a documentation of his thoughts and experiment with art and canvas and paint around this time. And this is, I've put this slide together to show the difference in the style of painting. Roberts, of course, was always concerned with making a living. He was a working artist, and he had to create subject matter that would have a market. And that is a big point of departure between his career and Russell's. And it comes out in their correspondence, because Roberts thinks a lot about his subject matter and how it is created. Whereas Russell says, you know, don't stop thinking, just do the art. And then this letter that you can see on the screen on the right is an example. There were 10 letters that were written between exchange from Russell to Roberts that are held in the library's collection, where Russell really articulates his philosophy about and the ideas he's coming up with a different palette that he's using, mixing his own colours and his ideas about how paint should be applied. And this is again influenced by other movements within France. The idea of juxtaposing colours to putting layers of colours next to each other and breaking the colour and dividing the colour, so you don't get that same blending in the palette that had been a practice previously. I also, at this time, Russell is living with his wife and family on Belle-Île. They've moved to Belle-Île full time, and they have 12 children are born within a 13-year period, but it's quite a tragic time for them because only 6 of the children survive to adulthood. The daughter, who is at the back, Marianne, is on the left at the back, and then the eldest daughter on the right. And then we have the surviving boys in the front. This is Russell here and launching a turtle race. And the little boy here with the halo is Sandro, Jean Sandro. So Jean Sandro was the eldest of the Russell boys, and in between his birth and the next surviving child, there was a raft of losses. So I think the survival of the eldest son was certainly an important landmark for the family. They were very intent on cherishing all their children, but Sandro in particular. And I think that's why we have this wonderful sketch and series of sketches of Sandro. It's a robust proof of life portrait that he has survived. And there are a series of these drawings that were made around about the same time that are held in different collections. And it is quite extraordinary that the library holds this little oil sketch that was created by Russell on the occasion of Sandro's 5th birthday in 1894. Yes, sorry, an announcement.
Please. The library will be closing in 10 minutes time at 1:30 p.m. It would be appreciated if you could collect your belongings and make your way to the main exit. I repeat, the library will be closing in 10 minutes time at 1:30 p.m. It would be appreciated if you could collect your belongings and make your way to the main exit. The library will reopen at 2:30 p.m. today for the afternoon session. Thank you.
Great. We're back on? Yeah. Yeah, so it was because of the look of the canvas. When we found it saw it down in the frame picture store, we just wondered whether something had gone on with the surface of it. It didn't look like a particularly finished work, and it was just a very unusual pigmentation that seemed to be on the surface of the canvas. So we decided that it would be wonderful opportunity to do a proper investigation of the canvas. And as I say, this is what is discussed in greater detail in the article in the SL Mag, the Winter 2019 article. And you can see here is Kate Hughes, conservator, examining the painting with X-ray fluorescence. And you can see the image that's thrown up from that at the top of this. And it really just enables the conservators to work out the range of pigments that are used in the canvas and any changes that might have been made to the work. Also through X-ray, it was discovered that the canvas had probably been recycled, had potentially been used for a landscape, maybe a seascape in the past, and then just rotated 90 degrees to to provide a surface for the painting of Jean Sandro. And it was through analysis of the painting and also looking at the documentation supplied in Russell's letters to Roberts that we were able to confirm that the pigments and the application on the canvas really followed what was known about Russell's techniques at the time, and that in all likelihood some of the discoloration that had came about was as a result of this experimental technique and colour palette that he was using, because he was mixing a lot of his own paints himself, and he later on he did develop much better techniques, and so a lot of the issues that perhaps we see in this little portrait were totally well resolved by the time he was doing his really turbulent and stunning seascapes, for which he is best known. I also wanted to mention that, so just after the portrait of Jean Sandro is painted, Russell has another encounter on Belle-Île, quite extraordinary that the artists were, these leading artists, European artists, were coming to the island because of its well-known beauty. And so Russell encountered Henri Matisse, and as Matisse is quoted, he says that Russell was his teacher and that Russell explained colour theory to him. And that really puts, I think, the work of Russell into an international category. He really, even though he perhaps wasn't well known at the time, his works weren't exhibited and they weren't compared to other artists painting at the time. They have certainly stood the test of time, and this was acknowledged by his contemporaries. There was great sadness again in the beginning of the 20th century because Russell's wife, Marianne, died of cancer, and it really fragmented and fractured the family. They eventually sold Russell sold the house that the family had on Belle-Île. He moved back to Paris. He had a studio in Paris, had it since the 1880s, and he brought all of his canvases. Many were destroyed on Belle-Île, but the rest of his work was brought to Paris, and it was left there really till the end of his life. He, in the 1920s, he moved back to Australia with his second wife, and he had a little studio at Watson's Bay, 22 Pacific Street. And this is where his connection to the Perrier family is remade. Albert James Perrier was a photographer. So he's the son of Edward Perrier, the French professor. And it is through Albert Perrier that the portrait of Jean Sandro and also the photograph of the family on Belle-Île made their way to the library's collection. They were donated to the library in '54. So one imagines, we don't have proof that Russell has sent the painting of Jean Sandro to his friend and mentor, and maybe he was a father figure, and to show him that his eldest son was vigorous and doing well in France. So that was how the little painting made its way to Australia, and thankfully through Perrier, and to have the photographic evidence as well, I think is a really extraordinary pairing. And then again, to be able to link the canvas to the letters that we have in the library's collection. Unfortunately, Sandro himself didn't have that happy a life. As I said, the death of their mother really fractured the family. The eldest sister ended up, there was no correspondence with the boys after her marriage, and Jean Sandro went to England. He began life, a career as an actor. He did join up in the First World War, but he seems to have not really come out of the war well, and didn't really work again. And so this death notice, probate notice, was published, which confirms that he married and had 2 children, and that so he had died in 1947. I've paired it with this other beautiful image on the left, because it just shows you the idyllic existence that the family had known on Belle-Île, and the tragedy that sort of befell them once their mother was no longer with them and the family shattered. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and I'd like to answer questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Margot. That was brilliant. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful images there.
Well, it's easy to do a nice presentation when there's marvelous material.
That's right. We do have some questions actually about the material. Someone's asking, there's a few on this theme. Does the library have a larger collection of Russell's work, or is it one image?
That's why this is so extraordinary. There is the government printer image, Thomas Richards, and then this little sketch of Jean Sandro, which was why when, you know, we looked into the catalogue and we discovered it, it just seemed such an aberration. And as I say, I think it's the connection to Perrier, because Perrier being a photographer, we have quite a large collection of Perrier's photography from the 20th century. And so that is, you know, by association, the material has come to the library. So a fortunate association. And again, probably talking about the Francophile community within Sydney and the strength of the bonds between them. Russell also exhibited with the Camera Circle when he returned to Australia. He did a small exhibition of watercolours, so there was that sort of connection between them.
And so where is there a place where the majority of his work is held?
Yes, so his daughter, as I say, the bulk of the paintings were kept in the studio. At the end of his life, there was an auction. The paintings had been intended to go to various family members, and I think the auction result was that his son-in-law, Dr. Jouve, actually purchased almost the entire collection for Jean, the eldest daughter, which meant that the boys were effectively cut out of their father's artworks, and that really again exacerbated the tensions. And at the end of Jeanne's life, she left a lot of material to, there was, sorry, I'm not going to remember the name, but there's a museum in northern France which holds a lot of Russell's work, and there's also a group of material in the Louvre. But as I say, from the 1960s, there was this rediscovery of Russell's work by an Australian art historians and dealers, and that really invigorated the market, and people started to collect. So you do find really wonderful examples of his work in a range of Australian galleries. The Will Maloney, for instance, is held at the National Gallery of Victoria, and the Art Gallery of Australia has one of the little pencil sketches of Jean Sandro. And
would the portrait of Van Gogh be the most famous of his work, obviously?
Definitely. And as I say,
where is that held?
That's at the, oh dear, I did put it on.
That's okay.
It's at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, yes.
Beautiful. It's such a beautiful image, that one.
And I think it really does speak of the relationship between the artist and his subject and their friendship. Yeah, and that totally, it's interesting to see when you see all three of those portraits together, you know, near to each other, the men in Australia and then the Van Gogh, that it is very much a moment in Russell's life, and he is documenting his friends and acquaintances with that technique that he learned at the Slade School. And then when you see William Maloney, it's just such a contrast. And then of course, Jean Sandro is within that second phase of his portrait work.
Yeah, you get the feeling from that portrait, the Van Gogh portrait, that it was a real high point. You know, when you look at some art and you think, oh, that's someone at their peak kind of thing.
Yeah, I think so. And true, you know, you can see the connecting of souls there, you know, the real friendship, that look between the subject and the artist.
It's very beautiful. I think you may have answered this, but someone's just asked, was Russell a very popular artist in his day?
Well, not popular, because as I say, he didn't exhibit and he didn't need to sell his work. So, and he eventually did start to exhibit, I think it was in the early 1900s, and his work wasn't terribly well received by critics. And again, because he didn't have to earn his living by his art, he got a bit offended. So he, but I think amongst artistic circles, certainly in Australia, he seems to have had, you know, but see, Roberts and Streeton, they were working artists, and so they did have a different perspective. And Roberts sent a copy of Russell's letter to Arthur Streeton, or copied in comments, and Streeton says the same sort of, oh, I think this guy is just working too hard, you know, just bang him out. And it just shows you the different attitude that artists would have to, you know, to their work. You know, it's a career, it's a business for some, and for others it's you know, an exploration.
Who'd be a gigging artist, I tell you. Yeah, someone has just finally asked, what are the best resources to read on Russell? Can you?
Yeah, well, the book that was written for the Art Gallery exhibition by Wayne Tunnicliffe is a beautiful volume. There's all the article that, as I say, I based a lot of my reading on was by Anne Galbally and Robin Sloggett, it was an essay that was in the National Gallery of Victoria's magazine. And Anne Galbally also did the catalogue raisonné, where she went through and documented. So that was really the only other place that I saw our Jean Sandro listed. And it was great because you were able to see where, you know, what other works. And so that was an extraordinary piece of research done in the 1980s. But I think Tunnicliffe's is the most up-to-date and recent, and it's a beautiful book. I would, if you want a nice book, I'd buy that.
I'm going to just end on this because it's a great question. Someone has said that there's a plaque in the street in Watson's Bay where Russell has his studio, and one for Christina Stead, who lived 2 houses away.
Yeah.
Do we know if there was any link or if they knew each other? Do we know that at all?
No.
That's fancy.
No. I don't know, for instance, and it's a great question, and maybe one of our audience might know or be interested to follow it up. I think there was a really nice little community in Watson's Bay, and it certainly wouldn't have been a terribly heavily populated area at the time. And surely if they were, you know, across the road from each other, even if they just waved at the letterbox.
Someone could write a book about the dinner parties that happened there, maybe.
Yes, I think so. I do think he was a bit slightly reclusive when he came back to Australia. His wife was also, his second wife, I think she may have been hard of hearing as well. So I'm not 100% sure that they had a very big social life in Sydney when they returned. I think they visited with other French-speaking, Francophiles, but from my memory, they lived a much quieter life.
The second phase, as you say.
Yes.
Well, that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much, Margot. There were no problems at all, as you went perfectly. Beautiful images, wonderful questions, as usual. So it's just up to me to thank you very much, Margot, and to thank all of our viewers today. Thanks for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again soon at our next Curator's Choice in a couple of weeks' time. Take care, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.